Hey guys, welcome to the channel. Before we begin, if you're planning on falling asleep to this video, please introduce yourself in the comments or simply say hello. Every comment really helps. Also, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to help us grow. Let's begin. Nick and Jesse stood at the edge of the overgrown path, staring up at the looming silhouette of Blackwood Manor. The mansion, once a grand estate, now stood shrouded in decay and mystery, its darkened windows and crumbling facade a testament to its haunted past. "This is it," Nick said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "Our new home." Jessie nodded, her eyes wide with awe as she took in the sight before her. "It's even more incredible than I imagined," she replied, squeezing Nick's hand. "I can't believe we actually own this place." They had stumbled upon Blackwood Manor during a spontaneous weekend getaway, the mansion's eerie beauty captivating them both. After learning that the property was up for auction, they had decided to take a leap of faith and bid on it. To their surprise, they had won, and now they stood at the threshold of their new adventure. The front door creaked open as they stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of age and neglect. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the grand foyer. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper and cracked portraits, each one telling a story of a bygone era. "It's like stepping back in time," Jessie whispered, her voice echoing through the empty halls. "I wonder what secrets this place holds." Nick grinned, his curiosity piqued. "Only one way to find out," he said, leading her deeper into the mansion. They spent the next few days exploring every corner of Blackwood Manor, uncovering hidden rooms and forgotten treasures. The mansion was a labyrinth of corridors and staircases, each turn revealing new mysteries and wonders. Despite its state of disrepair, they could see the potential for restoring the manor to its former glory. But as they delved deeper into the heart of the mansion, strange occurrences began to unfold. At first, it was subtle, a faint whisper in the dead of night, a flicker of movement in the corner of their vision. They dismissed it as their imagination, the result of living in such an atmospheric and historic home. However, the disturbances grew more pronounced. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut without warning, and cold drafts would sweep through the rooms, chilling them to the bone. Jessie began to have vivid dreams, haunted by the faces of people she had never met but felt an inexplicable connection to. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Jessie broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Nick, do you ever feel like we're not alone here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Nick glanced at her, his expression serious. "I've been trying to ignore it, but yeah, I do," he admitted. "There's something about this place, it's like it's alive." Jessie nodded, her heart racing. "I've been having these dreams, Nick. They're so real. I see people, hear their voices. It's like they're trying to tell me something." Nick took her hand, his grip reassuring. "Maybe we should do some research," he suggested. "Find out more about the history of this place. Maybe it will help us understand what's going on." They spent the next few days poring over old records and documents, piecing together the history of Blackwood Manor. They learned that the mansion had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy industrialist named Edward Blackwood. The estate had been a hub of social activity, hosting lavish parties and gatherings. But the records also hinted at a darker side. There were whispers of strange disappearances, rumors of secret passages, and hidden chambers. The Blackwood family had fallen on hard times, their fortune dwindling away, and the mansion had been abandoned for decades. As they delved deeper, they discovered a chilling tale that sent shivers down their spines. According to local legends, Edward Blackwood had been involved in a series of gruesome crimes. He had been accused of murdering several people, their bodies never found. The townspeople believed that the spirits of his victims were trapped within the mansion, unable to find peace. One night, While exploring the basement, Nick and Jesse stumbled upon a hidden door. It creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing a hidden chamber filled with old, dusty furniture and strange symbols etched into the walls. "This must be where he did it," Jessie whispered, her voice trembling. "Where Edward Blackwood committed those crimes." Nick's grip on the flashlight tightened. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "This place isn't safe." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the chamber. The air grew thick with an oppressive presence, the temperature plummeting as a cold wind swirled around them. Shadows danced on the walls, and the faint whispers grew louder, filling their ears with a cacophony of voices. "Nick, what's happening?" Jessie cried, her heart pounding in her chest. Before Nick could respond, a figure materialized before them, a spectral apparition, its eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "Help us," it whispered, its voice echoing through the chamber. "Free us from this torment." Nick and Jessie exchanged a glance, their fear momentarily overshadowed by a surge of determination. They had come to Blackwood Manor seeking adventure, but they had found something far more profound, a chance to bring peace to the restless spirits trapped within its walls. "We'll help you," Nick said, his voice steady. "We'll find a way to set you free." The apparition nodded, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. "The truth lies hidden," it whispered. "Uncover it, and you will find the key to our release." As the figure faded away, the door creaked open once more, allowing them to escape the chamber. They emerged into the basement, their minds racing with questions and possibilities. The haunting of Blackwood Manor was far from over, but they were determined to uncover the truth and bring an end to the torment that plagued the spirits within its walls. And as they climbed the stairs back to the main floor, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the eyes of the past were upon them, guiding them toward a destiny they could never have imagined. The days following their discovery of the hidden chamber were a whirlwind of activity and sleepless nights. Nick and Jessie became consumed by their quest to uncover the secrets of Blackwood Manor and the tragic history of its former inhabitants. They knew that understanding the past was crucial to freeing the restless spirits trapped within the mansion. Jessie spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers and historical records. The more she read, the more she realized the extent of Edward Blackwood's malevolence. He had been a man of immense wealth and power, but his dark desires had led him down a path of unspeakable horror. The townspeople had whispered about the disappearances, but no one had dared to confront him, fearing his wrath. One evening, as Jessie sat surrounded by stacks of yellowed papers, she came across an article that sent shivers down her spine. It detailed the discovery of a hidden journal believed to belong to Edward Blackwood himself. The journal contained cryptic entries, hinting at his involvement in occult rituals and dark magic. It spoke of a powerful entity he had summoned, a malevolent force that demanded blood sacrifices. "Nick, you need to see this," Jessie said, her voice trembling as she handed him the article. Nick took the paper, his eyes scanning the text. "So he wasn't just a murderer," he said slowly. "He was involved in something much darker. This entity, it must be the one trapping the spirits here." Jessie nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of their discovery. "We need to find that journal," she said. "It might have the answers we need." Their search for the journal led them to the attic, a dusty and cluttered space filled with forgotten relics of the past. They spent hours sifting through old trunks and boxes, their anticipation growing with each passing moment. Finally, tucked away in a corner beneath a pile of tattered books, they found it, a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. Nick carefully opened the journal, his eyes widening as he read the first entry. "This is it," he whispered, "Edward Blackwood's journal. The journal was filled with detailed accounts of the rituals Edward had performed, the sacrifices he had made to appease the entity. It spoke of a powerful ritual that could bind the spirits to the manor, trapping them for eternity. But it also hinted at a way to break the curse, a counter-ritual that could release the spirits and banish the entity forever. "This is what we need," Jessie said, her voice filled with determination. "We can use this to free the spirits." Nick nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "But it's not going to be easy," he said. "These rituals are dangerous. We need to be prepared." Over the next few days, they gathered the necessary materials for the ritual, following the instructions laid out in the journal. They collected candles, herbs, and ancient symbols, carefully arranging them in the basement chamber where they had first encountered the apparition. The air was thick with anticipation and fear as they prepared for the ritual that would either free the spirits or doom them all. On the night of the ritual, the mansion was eerily silent. Nick and Jessie stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the flickering light of the candles. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow with an otherworldly energy, casting long shadows that danced and writhed in the darkness. "Are you ready?" Nick asked, his voice steady but his eyes filled with uncertainty. Jessie took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied. They began the ritual, chanting the ancient words inscribed in the journal. The air grew colder, and a gust of wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing several candles. The shadows on the walls twisted and contorted, taking on the shapes of anguished faces and tormented souls. As they continued to chant, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber. The malevolent entity was awakening, drawn by the power of the ritual. Nick and Jessie could feel its presence, a dark and oppressive force that sought to crush their spirits and consume their souls. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the chamber, and the apparition of Edward Blackwood appeared before them. His eyes burned with an unholy fire, and his voice was a chilling whisper that seemed to pierce their very souls. "You dare to defy me," he hissed. "You think you can break my curse?" Nick and Jessie stood their ground, their voices unwavering as they continued the ritual. The light intensified, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with a brilliant, ethereal radiance. The spirits of Blackwood Manor, drawn by the power of the ritual, began to materialize around them, their faces filled with sorrow and longing. "Free us," they whispered, their voices merging into a haunting chorus. "Release us from this torment." With a final, desperate cry, Nick and Jessie completed the ritual, their voices rising above the cacophony of whispers and growls. The chamber was filled with a blinding flash of light, and the air was filled with the sound of shattering glass as the curse was broken. The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the light as they were released from their eternal prison. But as the light began to fade, a dark figure emerged from the shadows, the malevolent entity that Edward Blackwood had summoned. The entity lunged at them, its eyes filled with malice and rage. Nick and Jessie fought back with all their strength, their determination and love for each other giving them the courage to stand against the darkness. In a final, climactic struggle, they managed to banish the entity, its form dissipating into the ether. But their victory came at a cost. Nick had been grievously injured during the struggle, his arm slashed by the entity's claws. As the light faded and the chamber returned to its former darkness, Jessie knelt beside him, her heart breaking at the sight of his injuries. "We did it," Nick whispered, his voice weak but filled with relief. "We freed them." Jessie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, we did," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "But you're hurt. We need to get you help." They managed to make their way back to the main floor, and Jessie called for an ambulance. Nick was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to save his life. But the damage was severe, and they had no choice but to amputate his arm. As Nick recovered from his surgery, Jessie found herself plagued by nightmares, dark, twisted visions of the entity and the horrors they had faced in Blackwood Manor. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had only just begun to uncover the true extent of the mansion's dark history. And as she sat by Nick's bedside, holding his hand and watching over him, she couldn't help but wonder if their victory had come at too high a price. The weeks following Nick's surgery were a blur of hospital visits and restless nights for Jessie. The doctors assured her that he was healing well, but the sight of his bandaged stump where his arm had once been filled her with a profound sadness. Nick tried to remain optimistic, reassuring Jessie they had done the right thing, but she could see the pain in his eyes. Jessie's nightmares grew worse with each passing night. Dark, twisted visions of the malevolent entity haunted her dreams, and she often woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still terribly wrong, that they hadn't truly banished the evil from Blackwood Manor. One night, Jessie had a particularly vivid nightmare. She was back in the hidden chamber, surrounded by the flickering light of the candles. The malevolent entity loomed over her, its eyes burning with hatred. It reached out to her, its claws inches from her face, and she could feel the icy grip of death closing in. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as the entity's claws were about to pierce her skin, she woke up, gasping for breath. Nick was at her side, and in an instant, his face etched with concern. "Jessie, it's just a nightmare," he said, holding her close. "It's over. We're safe now." But Jessie couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. "Nick, what if we didn't really banish it?" she whispered. "What if it's still out there waiting for us?" Nick sighed, his expression pained. "Jessie, we did everything we could. We followed the ritual exactly. We freed the spirits. The entity is gone." Jessie nodded, but the doubt lingered in her mind. She knew she couldn't rest until she was certain that the evil had been vanquished once and for all. A few days later, Jessie returned to Blackwood Manor. She needed to confront her fears and put her mind at ease. She walked through the dark, empty halls, her footsteps echoing off the walls. The mansion felt different now, less oppressive, but still filled with an eerie silence. She made her way to the hidden chamber, the site of their final confrontation with the entity. The candles had long since burned out, and the symbols on the walls were faint and faded. As she stood in the center of the chamber, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage to face whatever might still be lurking in the shadows. Suddenly, she felt a cold breeze brush against her skin, and a whispering voice filled the chamber. "Jessie," it said, the sound sending chills down her spine. "You cannot escape me." Her eyes flew open, and she saw the apparition of Edward Blackwood standing before her. His eyes burned with an unholy fire, and his face twisted into a cruel smile. "You think you can defeat me," he sneered. "You are nothing." Jessie's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. "We freed the spirits," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "We broke the curse." Edward's smile widened. "Yes, you freed them," he said. "But I am still here. I am eternal. You cannot banish me." Fear surged through Jessie, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You may be powerful," she said, "but you are not invincible. We will find a way to stop you." Edward's laughter echoed through the chamber, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You are a fool," he said. "You and your lover will suffer for your defiance. I will see to it." With that, he vanished, leaving Jessie alone in the darkness. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking. She knew now that their battle was far from over. The entity was still out there, and it would stop at nothing to destroy them. Jessie returned to the hospital, determined to share her discovery with Nick. He listened intently as she recounted her encounter with Edward Blackwood, his expression growing grimmer with each word. "We need to finish this," Nick said, his voice firm. We need to find a way to truly banish the entity. Jesse nodded. But how? We've already performed the ritual. What else can we do? Nick thought for a moment, his eyes narrowing in concentration. There must be something we missed, he said. Something in the journal or the historical records. We need to keep searching. They spent the next few days combing through the journal and the records Jesse had found at the library. It was painstaking work, but eventually they came across a passage that seemed promising. It spoke of a final, desperate ritual, a ritual that could banish even the most powerful entities, but at a great cost. This is it, Nick said, his eyes gleaming with determination. This is what we need. Jesse's heart sank as she read the details of the ritual. It required a sacrifice, one that could bind the entity to a physical object, which would then need to be destroyed. The risk was immense, and the consequences could be dire. Are you sure about this, Jesse asked, her voice filled with concern. It's dangerous. Nick took her hand, his eyes filled with resolve. We have to do this, Jesse. It's the only way to truly end this nightmare. They gathered the materials for the ritual, knowing that this would be their final confrontation with the malevolent entity. As they prepared, Jesse couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. She knew that their lives would never be the same after this night. They returned to Blackwood Manor one last time, their hearts heavy with the weight of their mission. The mansion seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy, as if it knew that its master was about to be challenged once more. In the hidden chamber, they arranged the materials and began the ritual. The air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding filled the room. They chanted the ancient words, their voices echoing off the walls. The ground trembled beneath them, and a dark, oppressive force filled the chamber. Edward Blackwood's apparition appeared before them, his eyes blazing with fury. "You dare to challenge me again," he roared. "You will suffer for your insolence." The malevolent entity surged forward, its form twisting and contorting into a monstrous shape. Nick and Jesse stood their ground, their voices unwavering as they continued the ritual. The air crackled with energy, and the ground shook violently. As the ritual reached its climax, a blinding light filled the chamber, and the entity let out a deafening roar. The symbols on the walls glowed with a brilliant, ethereal radiance, and the air was filled with the sound of shattering glass. The entity's form began to dissolve, its power draining away. But just as victory seemed within their grasp, a searing pain shot through Nick's body. He fell to the ground, his face contorted in agony. Jesse's heart raced as she knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "Nick, hold on," she cried. "We're almost there." With a final, desperate effort, they completed the ritual. The entity let out a final, anguished scream as it was bound to a physical object, a small, ornate mirror that had been hidden in the chamber. The mirror glowed with a dark, ominous light, its surface swirling with shadows. Jessie took the mirror in her hands, knowing what she had to do. She raised it above her head and brought it crashing down onto the ground. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, and a wave of dark energy surged through the chamber. The entity was gone, its power broken. But the cost had been great. Nick lay motionless on the ground, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Jessie's heart broke as she realized that their victory had come at a terrible price. She called for an ambulance, her hands shaking as she held Nick's hand. The paramedics arrived and rushed him to the hospital, but the damage was severe. Nick slipped into a coma, his body unable to withstand the strain of the ritual. Jessie spent every waking moment by his side, her heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. She knew that they had done what was necessary, but the cost was almost too much to bear. The nightmares continued to plague her, and she found herself questioning whether they had truly won. One night, as she sat by Nick's bedside, she felt a strange sense of unease. The room grew colder, and a whispering voice filled her mind. "You cannot escape me," it said. "I will always be with you." Jessie's heart raced as she looked around. But there was no one else in the room. She realized with a sinking feeling that the entity's presence still lingered, a dark shadow that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the weeks that followed, Jessie's mental state deteriorated. The constant nightmares and the guilt over Nick's condition took their toll, and she found herself slipping into a deep depression. Her friends and family tried to help, but nothing seemed to ease her pain. Eventually, Jessie was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, her mind unable to cope with the trauma she had experienced. She spent her days in a haze, her memories of Blackwood Manor and the entity that had haunted it a constant torment. One day, as she sat in her room, a nurse approached her with a concerned expression. "Jessie, there's someone here too." "See you," she said gently. Jessie looked up, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. She couldn't imagine who would want to visit her in this state. The door opened, and a familiar face stepped into the room. It was Nick, his arm still bandaged, but his eyes filled with determination. He walked over to her and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Jessie, I'm here," he said softly. "We're going to get through this together." Tears filled Jessie's eyes as she looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and sorrow. "Nick, I thought I lost you," she whispered. Nick shook his head, his grip on her hand tightening. "You didn't lose me," he said. "We're still here. We're still fighting." And as they sat together, holding each other close, Jessie realized that their battle was far from over. But as long as they had each other, they could face whatever darkness lay ahead. Mike John, Melissa Morgan. Valentine and Joe were inseparable friends who had known each other since high school. Their friendship had endured the test of time and grown stronger over the years. In their early 30s now, they still made it a point to go on adventures together. And this year, they decided to go camping. They settled on Whispering Woods, a forest with a sinister reputation for being cursed. The journey to Whispering Woods began with high spirits. They packed their gear, stocked up on food, and loaded their cars with everything they would need for a weekend in the wild. The forest was a 3-hour drive from their city, and as they drove deeper into the countryside, the urban landscape gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. The road grew narrower and more winding, flanked by tall, ancient trees that seemed to lean in, creating a tunnel of green. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" Morgan asked, his voice tinged with a hint of nervousness as they passed a dilapidated wooden sign that read "Whispering Woods, enter at your own risk." "Oh, come on, Morgan. It's just a bunch of old wives' tales," Mike replied, his voice filled with excitement. "Besides, we could use a little thrill." John, who was driving the lead car, glanced at the rearview mirror and saw Melissa's concerned expression. "We'll be fine," he said, trying to reassure her. "We're here to have fun, remember." Melissa forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, I guess you're right." Valentine, always the practical one, added, "Let's just stick together and be cautious. If things get too creepy, we can always pack up and leave." Joe, sitting beside Valentine, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the forest ahead. He had heard the stories about Whispering Woods, about how people went missing and how the trees seemed to whisper secrets to those who dared to enter, but he didn't want to dampen the group's spirits with his fears. They arrived at the clearing they had chosen for their campsite just before sunset. The spot was perfect, a flat, grassy area surrounded by tall trees with a clear view of the sky. They quickly set up their tents, built a fire pit, and arranged their camping chairs around it. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. The friends sat around the crackling fire, toasting marshmallows and sharing stories from their past. Laughter echoed through the trees, momentarily dispelling the eerie atmosphere. But as the night grew deeper, the mood began to shift. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing longer and darker. The cheerful chatter dwindled, replaced by uneasy glances and nervous chuckles. "Did you hear that?" Melissa asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The group fell silent, straining to hear. At first there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. Then faintly they heard it, a soft, whispering sound, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but more distinct, almost as if the forest itself was speaking to them. "It's probably just the wind," John said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or an animal," Mike added, trying to keep the mood light. "Maybe a deer or something." But the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from all around them, circling the campsite. The friends exchanged uneasy looks, their earlier bravado fading. "Let's not get carried away," Valentine said, her voice steady. "We're in the middle of a forest. Strange noises are to be expected." Morgan nodded, though his eyes darted nervously to the trees. "Yeah, you're right. Let's just enjoy the night." But it was hard to enjoy the night with the whispers growing louder. They sounded almost like voices, speaking a language none of them could understand. The friends huddled closer to the fire, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by a creeping sense of dread. Joe, who had been silent all evening, finally spoke up. "We should probably turn in for the night," he suggested. "It's been a long day, and we're all just a bit jumpy." The group reluctantly agreed, and they began to extinguish the fire and pack away their food. As they made their way to their tents, the whispers seemed to follow them, growing louder and more persistent. It was as if the forest was trying to communicate with them, to tell them something they couldn't comprehend. Inside their tents, the friends tried to sleep, but the whispers penetrated the thin fabric, filling their minds with unease. Melissa lay wide awake, staring at the tent ceiling, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the whispers clearly now, almost as if they were right beside her. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to ignore them. John, in the tent next to hers, was having similar trouble. He tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching them. He glanced over at Mike, who was already asleep, snoring softly. How could he sleep so soundly with those whispers all around them? Valentine and Joe shared a tent, and while Valentine tried to remain calm, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. She looked over at Joe, who was sitting up, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" Joe whispered, his voice trembling. Valentine nodded. "It's just the forest," she said, though she didn't believe it herself. "Try to get some sleep." Morgan, in his tent, was having the worst time of all. The whispers seemed to be inside his head, filling his mind with dark thoughts. He pressed his hands over his ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The whispers were relentless, their insidious voices gnawing at his sanity. Morning couldn't come soon enough. The friends emerged from their tents, bleary-eyed and exhausted. The whispers had finally ceased with the dawn, but the unease lingered. "Rough night?" Mike asked, trying to lighten the mood, though he looked just as tired as the rest of them. "You could say that," John replied, rubbing his eyes. "Those whispers. Did anyone else hear them?" Everyone nodded, their expressions grim. "We need to figure out what's going on," Valentine said, her voice firm. "Maybe there's a logical explanation." "Or maybe the stories are true," Morgan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe the forest really is cursed." No one had a response to that. The friends stood in uneasy silence, the weight of the previous night's experience hanging heavily over them. They knew that their adventure in Whispering Woods was far from over, and that the whispers were only the beginning of something far more sinister. The friends spent the morning discussing the eerie whispers and trying to rationalize what had happened the previous night. They decided to explore the forest, hoping to find a logical explanation for the strange occurrences. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The whispers grew louder, forming an almost constant background noise. The group was on edge, jumping at every rustle and shadow. "We should go back," Melissa said, her voice trembling. "This place is giving me the creeps." "Yeah, maybe we shouldn't have come here," John agreed, looking around nervously. But Mike, the most adventurous of the group, insisted they press on. "We can't turn back now. We came here to camp and explore, so let's do it." After walking for what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, partially covered in moss and vines. It looked like something out of an old horror movie, and the air around it seemed colder, the whispers louder. "What the hell is that?" Valentine asked, stepping closer to the altar. "I don't know, but it looks like it's been here for centuries," Joe replied, examining the intricate carvings on the stone. "Maybe it's some kind of ancient artifact." Morgan, who had been studying the markings, said, "These carvings, they look like some kind of ritualistic symbols. I think we should be careful." As they inspected the altar, John noticed a small, ornate box nestled among the roots at the base of the stone. He carefully pulled it out, revealing a strange artifact inside. It was a small, carved figurine, seemingly made of bone, with hauntingly empty eyes. "Oh, this is creepy," John said, holding it up for everyone to see. "Put it back," Melissa urged. "We don't know what it is, and I don't want to find out." Before they could decide what to do with the artifact, the forest seemed to come alive around them. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, and ghostly figures began to materialize in the shadows. The friends felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "We need to leave now," Mike said, his bravado from earlier gone. They turned to head back to camp, but the forest had other plans. No matter which direction they took, the path seemed to loop back to the clearing with the altar. It was as if the forest itself was manipulating their movements, trapping them. "This can't be happening," Morgan said, panic rising in her voice. "We're going in circles." "We have to stay calm," Mike said, trying to keep everyone focused. "Let's try to find a way out together." Hours passed, and the situation grew more desperate. The whispers were now accompanied by distant, mournful cries, and the ghostly figures seemed to be closing in. Exhausted and frightened, the group gathered around the altar once more. "We need to figure out what this thing is and why it's doing this to us," Joe said, pointing to the artifact. "That's it," Melissa said suddenly, her eyes wide with realization. "This artifact is the source of the curse. We need to do something with it." "What do you mean?" John asked. "Look at the symbols," Melissa said, pointing to the carvings. "I think this altar is part of some kind of ritual. Maybe if we return the artifact and perform the ritual, we can break the curse." Reluctantly, they agreed to try. They placed the artifact back on the altar and stood around it, unsure of what to do next. "Now what?" Mike asked. Morgan, who had been examining the carvings more closely, said, "We need to recite these symbols. I think it's some kind of incantation." As they began to chant the strange words carved into the stone, the air grew colder, and the forest fell silent. The ghostly figures watched from the shadows, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Just as they finished the incantation, the ground began to shake. The whispers turned into anguished wails, and a dark, malevolent presence filled the clearing. "What's happening?" Joe shouted over the noise. The friends looked around in terror as the trees seemed to close in on them, their branches reaching out like claws. The presence grew stronger, and they felt a suffocating sense of fear. Then, a booming voice echoed through the clearing. "You have found the artifact of the damned. To escape, a sacrifice must be made." The friends exchanged horrified looks. "What do you mean, a sacrifice?" Valentine asked, her voice shaking. "One of you must stay, or none shall leave," the voice replied. Panic set in. They argued, shouted, and pleaded, but the voice was unyielding. The ghostly figures closed in, their faces twisted in sorrow and rage. "Maybe we can fight it," Mike suggested desperately. "There has to be another way." But deep down, they knew the forest's demand was absolute. The friends huddled together, tears streaming down their faces, knowing they faced an impossible choice to sacrifice one of their own, or face an eternity trapped in the cursed forest. As they grappled with their fate, the ghostly figures drew nearer, and the dark presence loomed ever closer, waiting for their decision. The group stood in the clearing, the eerie silence amplifying the weight of the decision they had to make. Tension crackled in the air as they argued, each of their voices tinged with desperation and fear. "We can't sacrifice one of us," Morgan said, her voice firm but shaky. "We have to fight this thing. There has to be another way." "But what if we're wrong?" Joe countered, looking around at the haunted faces of his friends. "If we fight and lose, we all die. Isn't it better to sacrifice one to save the rest?" Valentine, her eyes filled with tears, shook her head. "I can't agree to that. We came here together and we should leave together. We can't just leave someone behind." Mike, ever the adventurer, sided with Morgan. "We fight. I'm not leaving anyone behind. We'll figure this out together." Melissa, torn between the two sides, finally spoke up. "I don't want to die here. But I don't want to lose any of you either. If there's a chance we can fight and win, I'm willing to take it." John, who had been quietly contemplating the situation, finally made his decision. "We fight. But we need a plan." The group nodded in agreement, their resolve hardening. They gathered around the ancient altar, studying the artifact that had brought this curse upon them. "We need to destroy this thing," Mike said, holding up the carved figurine. "It's the source of all this. If we can break it, maybe we can free the spirits and end the curse." "But how do we destroy it?" Morgan asked, her eyes scanning the altar for clues. "I think we need to use the altar," John said, his voice steady. "It's the focal point of the curse. If we perform the ritual in reverse, it might break the connection." They spent the next few hours preparing. Morgan and Melissa deciphered the symbols on the altar, trying to figure out the reverse incantation. Mike and Joe gathered supplies, fashioning crude weapons from branches and rocks. Valentine stood guard, keeping a watchful eye on the ghostly figures that seemed to be closing in on them. Finally, they were ready. They gathered around the altar, their faces grim with determination. "Remember, stay together and protect each other," Mike said, his voice strong. "We can do this." They began the reverse incantation, their voices blending in a low, steady chant. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The ghostly figures hovered at the edges of the clearing, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. As the incantation reached its climax, the ground began to shake. The whispers turned into anguished wails, and the dark presence that had haunted them since they found the artifact loomed closer. Now Mike shouted, "Destroy it." John, holding the artifact, brought it down on the altar with all his strength. The figurine shattered, and a blinding light erupted from the altar. The ghostly figures screamed, their forms dissolving into the light. But the dark presence was not so easily defeated. It lunged at them, a swirling mass of shadows and rage. The friends fought back, using their makeshift weapons to fend it off. "Keep going," Mike yelled, swinging a branch at the dark entity. John, his hand bleeding from the shards of the broken artifact, grabbed a piece of the figurine and held it up. "We need to contain it. Use the bottle." Morgan, realizing what he meant, grabbed an old glass bottle they had found near the altar. She held it up, and John began chanting the incantation again, his voice growing stronger with each word. The dark presence screamed in fury, but it was no match for their combined efforts. Slowly, it began to shrink, drawn towards the bottle. With one final, desperate lunge, it reached out, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around John's arm. "John!" No, Melissa screamed. John gritted his teeth, using all his strength to force the entity into the bottle. The pain was excruciating, but he didn't falter. With a final surge of effort, he closed the bottle, trapping the dark presence inside. The forest fell silent. The ghostly figures were gone, and the whispers had ceased. The friends stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had just accomplished slowly sinking in. John collapsed to the ground, clutching his injured arm. Blood poured from the deep gashes, and it was clear that the damage was severe. "We need to get him help," Joe said urgently. "He's losing too much blood." They fashioned a makeshift tourniquet to slow the bleeding and help John to his feet. The forest, now devoid of its supernatural presence, seemed less threatening. They found their way back to camp with surprising ease, the path no longer twisting and turning to trap them. As they reached the edge of the forest, they looked back one last time. The ancient altar was now just a pile of stones, the artifact destroyed and the curse lifted. They knew they would never forget the horrors they had faced, nor the sacrifices they had made. They managed to get John to a hospital in time to save his life, but his arm had to be amputated. The group was haunted by the memories of that night, each of them bearing the psychological scars of their ordeal. In the months that followed, they tried to move on with their lives, but the whispers of the forest lingered in their minds, a constant reminder of the darkness they had faced. For Morgan, Mike, Melissa, Joe, and Valentine, life would never be the same. They had fought the darkness and won, but the cost had been high. And as they lay awake at night, they could still hear the faint echoes of the whispering woods, a chilling reminder that some curses are never truly broken. Joe had been driving his taxi for nearly 2 decades, and the late-night shifts had become a routine. The streets were quieter, the fares fewer, but the nights were filled with stories. Tonight, however, would be different. Tonight, he would encounter something that would forever change his understanding of the world. It was a cold, foggy night, the kind where the mist clings to everything and visibility is reduced to mere feet. Joe had just dropped off his last fare and was heading back towards the center of town, hoping for one more passenger before calling it a night. The clock on his dashboard showed 2:14 a.m. As he drove past the dimly lit streets, his headlights slicing through the fog, he saw her, a woman standing on the corner, her figure barely visible in the murk. She wore an old-fashioned dress, the kind that looked like it belonged in a different century. Joe slowed down and pulled over. The woman stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. As she opened the back door and slid into the seat, Joe felt an inexplicable chill creep up his spine. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but her face was obscured by the shadows and the brim of a wide hat. "Where to, Mom?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She handed him a small piece of paper. Joe took it and read the address, 23 Blackwood Lane. He frowned. He knew every corner of the city, but he couldn't recall ever hearing of Blackwood Lane. "All right, ma'am. I'll get you there," he said, trying to sound confident. The woman didn't respond. She simply nodded and sat back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Joe put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, glancing occasionally at the woman in the mirror. She remained silent, her eyes fixed on something unseen. As Joe drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The streets seemed darker than usual, and the fog thicker. He turned onto a narrow road that wound through a densely wooded area. The further he went, the more uneasy he felt. Finally, he spotted the street sign for Blackwood Lane, barely visible through the fog. The road was unpaved and lined with ancient, gnarled trees whose branches intertwined overhead, forming a tunnel of sorts. Joe's headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and he had to drive slowly to avoid the potholes. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the end of the lane and saw the house. It was a large, imposing structure, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The house looked abandoned, its windows broken and shutters hanging loose. Ivy crept up the walls, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. "We're here," Joe said, turning to look at his passenger. But the back seat was empty. He blinked, his heart racing. The woman was gone. He hadn't heard the door open or close. She had simply vanished. Joe's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Taking a deep breath, he got out of the car and walked around to the back seat, hoping to find some explanation. The door was closed, and the seat was empty. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all, except for a faint, lingering coldness. Joe looked up at the house. Something compelled him to investigate further. Despite the fear gnawing at his insides, he approached the front door, which hung slightly ajar, and pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, echoing through the empty hall. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely more than a whisper. There was no answer. The interior of the house was just as decrepit as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. The air was musty and stale. Joe walked through the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the wooden floors. He entered what appeared to be the living room. The furniture was old and covered in white sheets, as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. A grand fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel cluttered with old photographs and knickknacks. Joe picked up one of the photographs, brushing off the dust. It showed a family, parents and 2 children, standing in front of the house, smiling. The picture was yellowed with age, and the faces looked like they belonged to another era. As he replaced the photograph, something caught his eye, a piece of paper sticking out from under one of the sheets. He pulled it free and unfolded it. It was a letter written in elegant, flowing script. "To whomever finds this. The house at 23 Blackwood Lane is cursed. My family and I moved here in the spring of 1923, hoping for a fresh start. But from the moment we arrived, strange things began to happen. We heard whispers in the night, saw figures moving in the shadows, and felt an ever-present cold. The final straw came one night when my wife, Eleanor, disappeared without a trace. The children and I searched everywhere, but she was gone. I believe the house took her, just as it has taken others before her. If you find this letter, please leave this place and never return. The spirits here are restless and will stop at nothing to claim more souls. May God have mercy on us all. Yours truly, Thomas Blackwood." Joe's hands shook as he read the letter. He looked around the room, half expecting to see the ghostly figure of Eleanor standing in the shadows. The silence was oppressive, the coldness more pronounced. Suddenly he felt a chill breeze brush past him, and the whispers began. Faint at first, then growing louder, as if coming from all around him. Joe backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned and ran out of the house, not stopping until he was back in the safety of his taxi. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers faded, but the fear remained. Joe started the car and sped away from Blackwood Lane, not daring to look back. As he drove through the fog, his mind raced. Who was the woman he had picked up? Was she Eleanor? And what had happened to her and her family? The questions swirled in his mind, but one thing was clear: he had encountered something beyond the realm of the natural, something that defied explanation. Joe vowed never to return to Blackwood Lane, but the memory of that night would haunt him forever. And though he tried to forget, the whispers of the phantom passenger would echo in his mind, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of reality. Joe couldn't shake the events of that night. The memory of the mysterious woman in old-fashioned clothing, the eerie silence of the abandoned house, and the chilling letter he found haunted him. He knew he had to find out more. He owed it to the woman, to himself, and to his sanity. The next morning, Joe sat at his kitchen table. The letter from Thomas Blackwood spread out in front of him. He sipped his coffee, trying to think clearly. The letter hinted at a dark past, a curse, and restless spirits. Joe needed to understand what had happened at 23 Blackwood Lane. He decided to start at the public library. The local history section would have records, newspapers, and perhaps some insight into the house's dark history. Joe made his way there, feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. At the library, he approached the reference desk. An elderly librarian looked up from her book and smiled. "How can I help you today?" she asked. "I'm looking for information on an old house, 23 Blackwood Lane. I need to know its history and anything unusual that might have happened there," Joe explained. The librarian's smile faded slightly. Blackwood Lane. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. That place has quite a reputation. Follow me. She led Joe to a back room filled with dusty archives. You'll find old newspapers, property records, and some police reports here. Good luck. Joe thanked her and began his search. Hours passed as he sifted through yellowed pages and brittle documents. He discovered that the house had been built in the late 1800s by the Blackwood family, who were prominent members of the community. However, the family's fortune dwindled, and the house fell into disrepair. What caught Joe's attention were the headlines from the 1920s. Several young women had gone missing, and their last known sightings were always the same: they were seen getting into a taxi. Joe felt a chill run down his spine as he read the details. The women vanished without a trace, and the cases remained unsolved. One name stood out: Emily. She was one of the missing women, and her photograph in the newspaper matched the description of the passenger Joe had picked up. Emily had been last seen leaving a party late at night, stepping into a taxi. Her disappearance had devastated her family and the community. Joe found an old police report about Emily's case. It described her as a young woman in her 20s, with a kind heart and a bright future. The investigation had stalled due to a lack of evidence, and her case, like the others, had gone cold. As Joe delved deeper, he found references to a local legend. It was said that the spirits of the missing women haunted the streets, seeking justice for their untimely deaths. Some believed that their souls were trapped, unable to move on until their killer was found and punished. Joe felt a renewed sense of purpose. Emily's spirit had chosen him to help solve the mystery and bring justice to her and the other victims. He was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The first sign that something was wrong came that night. Joe was in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. He heard whispers, faint at first, then growing louder. He sat up, his heart pounding. The room was cold, and he could see his breath in the air. "Help us," the voices whispered. "Find him. Bring him to justice." Joe looked around, but the room was empty. The whispers continued, pleading and insistent. He realized they were coming from inside his head, urging him to act. The next day, Joe returned to the library. He found more old police reports and newspaper clippings. The pattern was clear. The women had all been picked up by a taxi driver. Joe pieced together the information and realized that the murderer had used his job to prey on unsuspecting women. Joe's investigation took him to the police station, where he requested access to the old case files. The officer on duty was skeptical, but eventually agreed to let Joe review the documents. As he pored over the reports, Joe noticed a recurring detail. Several witnesses had described the taxi driver as having a distinctive scar on his left cheek. Armed with this new information, Joe visited the local archives to find records of taxi drivers from the 1920s. He spent hours combing through employment records, looking for someone who matched the description. Finally, he found a name: Henry Collins. Henry had been a taxi driver during the time of the murders and had a scar on his left cheek, according to his employment records. Joe's heart raced as he read more about Henry. He had been a quiet man, keeping to himself and living in a small apartment near the edge of town. There were no records of him. After the late 1920s, he seemed to have vanished, just like his victims. Determined to learn more, Joe visited Henry's old apartment building. The place was now a rundown tenement, but the landlord allowed Joe to look around. Inside the apartment, Joe found old photographs and letters, hinting at Henry's troubled past. He had been a soldier in World War I and had returned home with deep psychological scars. The letters spoke of his struggle to reintegrate into society and his growing resentment towards women, whom he blamed for his loneliness and misery. As Joe pieced together the story, he began experiencing more paranormal activities. Ghostly apparitions appeared in his home, fleeting glimpses of the women who had been murdered. They pointed him towards clues, guiding his investigation. Joe started having vivid dreams, in which he relived the final moments of the victims. Each dream provided more pieces to the puzzle, leading Joe closer to the truth. One night, Joe dreamt of Emily's last moments. He saw her leaving the party, getting into Henry's taxi, and sensing something was wrong as they drove away from the city. He felt her fear as Henry drove her to a secluded spot, his intentions becoming clear. The dream ended with Emily's desperate struggle and her final, terrified scream. Joe woke up in a cold sweat, the dream still fresh in his mind. He knew he was running out of time. The spirits were growing more restless, and he could feel their desperation. They needed closure, and so did he. With renewed determination, Joe revisited the abandoned house on Blackwood Lane. He felt drawn to the place, believing it held the final key to solving the mystery. As he explored the house, he found an old diary hidden in a secret compartment in the living room. The diary belonged to Henry Collins. It detailed his descent into madness, his growing obsession with the women he picked up, and his twisted justification for the murders. Henry believed he was cleansing the world of sinful women, saving them from their own depravity. The final entry in the diary was dated the night Emily disappeared. Henry described how he had taken her to the house on Blackwood Lane, where he had killed her and buried her body in the basement. He expressed no remorse, only a sick satisfaction in his actions. Joe felt a surge of anger and sorrow as he read the diary. He knew what he had to do. He called the police and reported his findings, handing over the diary as evidence. The authorities launched a new investigation, and with the diary's detailed descriptions, they soon found the remains of Emily and the other victims in the basement of the abandoned house. The case was finally solved, and the spirits of the murdered women could rest in peace. Joe felt a profound sense of relief, knowing he had fulfilled his promise to Emily. But the experience had changed him. He could never forget the horrors he had uncovered, or the voices that had guided him. As Joe drove his taxi through the quiet streets, he couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Emily sitting there. But the back seat was always empty, and the whispers had finally ceased. Joe had brought justice to the victims, but the shadows of the past would always linger in his mind, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the ordinary world. The old Victorian house stood at the edge of town, its weathered facade and secrets within. For the Johnson family, it was both a blessing and a burden, an unexpected inheritance from a distant great-aunt who had passed away under mysterious circumstances. As they unpacked boxes and explored the dusty rooms, they discovered a treasure trove of antique furniture, paintings, and a collection of meticulously crafted dolls. "Look at these," Mom exclaimed Sarah, the eldest daughter, holding up a porcelain doll with delicate features and a frilly dress. "They're beautiful, but kind of creepy." Our mother, Emily, smiled wearily. "They belong to Aunt Atha. She always had a fascination with dolls. Remember, she used to send us dolls every Christmas." Sarah nodded, her gaze shifting to the youngest member of the family, 6-year-old Tommy. Tommy was crouched in a corner, his small hands carefully cradling a doll that seemed to radiate a strange aura. "What have you got there?" Tommy asked Emily, walking over to him. Tommy looked up with wide eyes, his blonde curls falling over his forehead. "This one," he said softly, holding out the doll for his mother to see. It was unlike the others, weathered with age, its porcelain face chipped in places, but its eyes held an unsettling lifelike quality. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had seen many dolls in Aunt Atha's collection, but this one sent a shiver down her spine. Its painted lips seemed to curl into a faint smile, and its eyes, though glassy, seemed to follow her every move. "It's called Eliza," Tommy continued, oblivious to his mother's unease. "She's nice. She talks to me." Sarah raised an eyebrow, exchanging a puzzled look with her mother. "Talks to you? Dolls don't talk, Tommy." Tommy nodded solemnly. "Not out loud, but in my head. She tells me things." Emily knelt beside Tommy, trying to hide her discomfort. "What kind of things does Eliza tell you?" Tommy hesitated, his gaze fixed on the doll's face. "She says she used to belong to a little girl named Lucy. Lucy was sad because her parents fought all the time. Eliza helped her feel better." Emily glanced at Sarah, who shrugged. "Kids and their imaginations," Sarah muttered under her breath. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Eliza than met the eye. Aunt Agatha had always been eccentric, but this doll seemed to carry a weight of its own, a history that Tommy had somehow tapped into. As days turned into weeks, Emily noticed changes in Tommy. He became more withdrawn, spending hours in his room playing with Eliza and talking to her as if she were a real person. He seemed entranced by the doll, oblivious to everything else around him. Emily tried to broach the subject with her husband, David, one evening after putting Tommy to bed. They sat in the dimly lit living room, the only sound the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. "I'm worried about Tommy," Emily admitted quietly, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Ever since we came here and he found that doll, he's been acting strange." David frowned, running a hand through his hair. "He's just adjusting to the move, Em. Kids have imaginary friends all the time." "It's more than that," Emily insisted, her voice trembling. "He talks to Eliza as if she's alive. He tells me things he shouldn't know." David sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe we should take him to see someone, a therapist, or..." Emily shook her head. "No, it's not that. I think there's something wrong with that doll, David. I can't explain it, but it feels like it's watching us." David glanced towards Tommy's bedroom, a troubled expression on his face. "Maybe we should get rid of it." Emily hesitated, her thoughts racing. "I don't know if that would help. Tommy loves Eliza. It's like she's become his best friend." David sighed again, his shoulders slumping. "We'll keep an eye on him. If things get worse, we'll figure something out." But things did get worse. Tommy's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started having nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. He became obsessed with Eliza refusing to go anywhere without her. Emily found him whispering to the doll in the dark corners of the house, his words unintelligible yet filled with urgency. One stormy night, Emily woke to find Tommy missing from his bed. Heart pounding, she rushed through the darkened house, calling his name. Lightning flashed, casting eerie shadows on the walls as she reached Tommy's room. And there, in the faint glow of a flickering candle, she found him. Tommy was standing in front of the attic door, Eliza cradled in his arms. His eyes were wide and vacant, his small frame trembling. "Tommy, what are you doing?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Tommy turned to her, his expression haunted. "Eliza wants to show me something. She says there's a secret in the attic." Emily's blood ran cold. The attic had always been locked, and Aunt Agatha had forbidden anyone from going up there. She had always claimed it was filled with old memories best left undisturbed. But Tommy seemed drawn to the attic, compelled by a force neither Emily nor David could understand. As he reached for the doorknob, Emily grabbed his arm, her voice frantic. "No, Tommy, we can't go up there," she pleaded, her eyes searching his face for any sign of recognition. "Please, come back to bed." Tommy stared at her for a long moment, his eyes clouded with confusion. Then, as if awakening from a trance, he nodded slowly. "Okay, Mommy." Emily hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It's going to be okay, Tommy. We'll figure this out." But as she carried him back to his room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and malevolent had awakened in their new home. A presence that had been dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "I understand. Let's proceed with the story." The days following the arrival of the antique dolls at the family's home were far from ordinary. Strange occurrences began to unfold, subtle at first, but increasingly unsettling as time passed. It started with small things. Objects mysteriously moving from one place to another, whispers heard in empty rooms, and the faint scent of old roses lingering in the air. Emily, the youngest child, had taken an immediate liking to a particular doll from the collection. It was a delicate porcelain doll with intricate lace dress and glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow anyone who passed by. Named Charlotte by Emily, the doll soon became her constant companion, carried everywhere from breakfast to bedtime. At first, her parents, Sarah and Michael, found it endearing. They thought it was just a phase, a child's attachment to a new toy. However, as the days went by, they noticed a change in Emily. She became unusually quiet, spending long hours in her room with Charlotte, engaging in one-sided conversations that Sarah often overheard when passing by the closed door. One evening, as Sarah tucked Emily into bed, she noticed Charlotte sitting on the nightstand, its eyes seemingly fixed on her. Sarah shivered involuntarily, feeling a strange unease she couldn't quite explain. She kissed Emily goodnight and left the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Later that night, Sarah woke to a soft creaking sound coming from Emily's room. Heart racing, she crept down the hallway and peeked through the cracked door. What she saw sent a chill down her spine. Emily was standing in the middle of the room, holding Charlotte by the hand and whispering to the doll in a voice that was not her own. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but the tone was eerie, filled with a strange cadence that made her skin crawl. She watched, frozen in place, as Emily and Charlotte seemed to sway together in a macabre dance, the dim moonlight casting elongated shadows on the walls. Unable to bear the sight any longer, Sarah pushed the door open. "Emily, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and concern. Emily turned slowly, her eyes vacant, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Charlotte says she wants to play forever," Emily replied, her voice monotone and distant. Sarah rushed forward, snatching the doll from Emily's grasp, "Emily, dolls don't talk. They're just toys," she said firmly, trying to sound reassuring despite her own rising dread. But Emily's expression remained blank, as if she couldn't hear her mother's words. Sarah felt a surge of panic. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She took Emily by the hand and led her back to bed, carefully placing Charlotte on a high shelf out of reach. As Sarah tucked Emily in again, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced around the room, half expecting to see Charlotte's glassy eyes staring back at her from the shadows. But the doll remained silent and still on the shelf, its painted smile seeming unnervingly lifelike in the moonlight. Sarah stayed by Emily's side until she fell asleep, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. What had possessed her daughter to act that way? And why did the presence of Charlotte seem to cast such a sinister shadow over their once happy home? The next morning, Sarah resolved to learn more about the dolls and their mysterious origins. She recalled the letter that accompanied the inheritance, a note from a distant relative mentioning the doll maker's name, an elusive figure known for his intricate craftsmanship and rumored involvement in the occult. With a sense of foreboding, Sarah began her investigation into the doll maker's past, unaware of the dark secrets she was about to uncover and the malevolent forces that had been awakened within their home. The tension in the house had reached an unbearable peak. The strange occurrences had become more frequent and intense. The once warm and inviting home now felt like a prison, with shadows that moved on their own and whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. The family knew they had to act quickly if they were to save their youngest child, Lily, from the malevolent spirit of the doll maker. In the midst of their desperation, Emma, the mother, stumbled upon an old journal hidden in the attic. It belonged to her distant relative, the doll maker himself. The journal detailed his obsession with dark magic and his ultimate goal to transfer his soul into one of his creations to achieve immortality. Emma's heart sank as she read about the ritual he had performed, binding his soul to the very doll that now possessed her daughter. Determined to break the curse, Emma and her husband, Mark, decided to seek the help of a local historian and occult expert, Professor Harold. They invited him to their home, explaining the dire situation they were in. After examining the doll and the journal, Professor Harold confirmed their worst fears: the doll maker's soul was indeed trapped within the doll, and the only way to free their daughter was to destroy the doll and perform a cleansing ritual. The family prepared for the ritual that night. The atmosphere was thick with fear and uncertainty, but they knew they had no other choice. Professor Harold instructed them to gather specific items: salt, sage, holy water, and the silver dagger. They also needed a personal belonging of the doll maker, which they found in the attic, an old locket containing a picture of the doll maker and his wife. As midnight approached, they gathered in the living room. The air was cold and heavy, and the sense of foreboding was palpable. Professor Harold drew a circle of salt around the room, explaining that it would protect them from the spirit's wrath during the ritual. Emma and Mark held hands, their faces pale with fear, while Lily sat in the center of the circle, clutching the cursed doll. Professor Harold began chanting in a language that sounded ancient and otherworldly. He sprinkled the holy water around the room and waved the burning sage, the smoke curling into the air like ethereal tendrils. The doll in Lily's arms began to twitch and writhe, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Lily's own eyes turned vacant and glassy, and she began to speak in a voice that was not her own. "You cannot destroy me," the voice hissed. "I am eternal." Emma's grip on Mark's hand tightened. "We have to be strong," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Professor Harold continued the incantation, his voice growing louder and more authoritative. He held the silver dagger aloft and commanded the spirit to leave Lily and return to the doll. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to dance around them. The doll's movements became more frantic, as if it were fighting against an invisible force. With a final, forceful command, Professor Harold plunged the silver dagger into the doll's chest. A piercing scream filled the room, echoing off the walls and causing the lights to flicker. The doll convulsed violently before falling still, its eyes losing their unnatural glow. Lily gasped and collapsed, her body going limp. Emma rushed to her side, tears streaming down her face. "Lily, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lily's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at her mother. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice weak but her own. Emma hugged her tightly, relief washing over her. "You're safe now, sweetie. It's over." Professor Harold instructed Mark to take the doll outside and burn it, ensuring that the curse would be broken for good. As Mark set the doll ablaze, a sense of calm and warmth began to return to the house. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the whispers and shadows vanished. The family gathered together, embracing each other with a new appreciation for their safety and sanity. They thanked Professor Harold for his help, knowing that they could not have done it without him. As they watched the last embers of the doll burn away, they felt a sense of closure and peace. Days turned into weeks, and the house returned to its normal, happy state. The memories of the haunting began to fade, replaced by the laughter and love that filled their home. Lily, though occasionally haunted by nightmares, gradually returned to her cheerful self, reassured by the presence of her loving family. Emma and Mark decided to keep the journal and the locket as a reminder of what they had been through, but they locked them away, hoping they would never need to revisit that dark chapter of their lives. They knew that they had faced a great evil and emerged victorious, and that knowledge gave them strength. In the end, the family was finally at peace, their bond stronger than ever. The dollmaker's curse had been broken, and the malevolent spirit that had once threatened their lives was gone for good. They could now look forward to the future with hope and gratitude, knowing that they had the courage and love to overcome even the darkest of curses. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold as Michael's car spluttered to a halt. He cursed softly, frustration etched on his face as he checked his phone. No signal. The deserted highway stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by vast fields and occasional clusters of skeletal trees that whispered in the breeze. In the distance, a town emerged, a collection of weather-beaten buildings with fading paint and cracked windows. Michael squinted against the dying light, trying to make out the name on the worn sign, "Welcome to Ashwood." Reluctantly, Michael gathered his backpack and began the trek towards the town. Each step kicked up dust, disturbing the silence that enveloped the landscape. There were no sounds of life, no distant hum of civilization, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of a loose board. As he neared the outskirts of Ashwood, an eerie sensation settled over him. The air seemed unnaturally still, devoid of the usual ambient noises one would expect from even the quietest of towns. The main street lay ahead, a desolate thoroughfare lined with abandoned shops and forgotten storefronts. The first building he passed was a general store, its windows boarded up and the wooden sign swinging listlessly on rusted chains. Faded advertisements for long-forgotten products adorned the walls, their colors bleached by years of exposure to the elements. Next to it stood a diner, its once bright neon sign now dark and cracked, tables and chairs upturned, as if the patrons had fled in a hurry. Michael's footsteps echoed hollowly against the cobblestones as he ventured further into the heart of Ashwood. He glanced around, half expecting to see a resident peeking through a window or hear the bark of a dog, but the town remained eerily deserted. Approaching what appeared to be the town square, Michael paused by a dry fountain, its basin cracked and filled with fallen leaves. Surrounding benches lay empty, draped with cobwebs that shimmered faintly in the fading light. He called out tentatively, his voice echoing against the silent buildings. But there was no reply, just the haunting echo of his own words. A shiver ran down Michael's spine as he realized the depth of the silence that gripped Ashwood. It was as if time itself had frozen the town in place, preserving it in a state of perpetual abandonment. He wandered past more deserted buildings. A bookstore with shelves bare and books scattered on the floor. A hardware store with tools rusted and forgotten. The sinking sun cast long shadows that stretched across the cobblestones, merging with the encroaching darkness. Michael's unease grew with each passing moment, a gnawing feeling that he was not alone in this silent enclave. He pushed open the creaking door of what appeared to be the town's inn, its once grand facade now weather-worn and tired. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of neglect. The lobby lay deserted, furniture overturned, and an ancient register gathering dust on the counter. Michael hesitated, then called out again, hoping for a response, but only silence answered him. With dusk deepening into night, Michael retraced his steps to the main street. He glanced up at the darkening sky, feeling a rising sense of urgency. His phone remained stubbornly useless, devoid of signal or connection. Ashwood had trapped him, ensnaring him in its web of silence and solitude. A chill wind whispered through the empty streets as Michael searched for a place to spend the night. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ashwood held secrets buried beneath its silent facades, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. As darkness settled over the town, Michael found himself standing at the edge of the square, staring out at the deserted landscape. He knew he would have to wait until morning, hoping against hope that the first light would bring answers or escape from this unsettling place. The stars emerged, pinpricks of light in the velvet sky, casting a cold glow over the abandoned town of Ashwood. Michael settled in for a long, uneasy night, his thoughts swirling with questions and apprehensions about what lay ahead in this silent, mysterious town. The traveler, now fully aware of the eerie emptiness that gripped the town, walked cautiously down the deserted main street. Every building loomed over him, silent and seemingly abandoned, yet signs of recent activity persisted. A half-open door swayed in the breeze, curtains fluttered in a forgotten draft. Pushing open the door of what appeared to be the town hall, the traveler entered a room that felt oddly preserved in time. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that cut through the heavy curtains. A large desk dominated the center of the room, strewn with papers and ledgers, as if the town clerk had just stepped out for a moment. A sense of foreboding intensified as the traveler sifted through the papers, finding records of ordinary lives frozen in time: birth certificates, marriage licenses, and tax receipts. Yet, among the mundane, one document stood out, a weathered journal tucked beneath a stack of old newspapers. The journal's cover, embossed with fading gold letters, revealed it belonged to Jonas Merriweather, a name that echoed in local lore as both a scholar and a recluse. The traveler's fingers trembled slightly as they opened the first page, revealing ink that had bled slightly with age. October 23rd, 1887. The town stands silent as the fog rolls in. They are coming, dark shapes on the horizon, demanding tribute. We've sealed the town, hoping they won't find us. The journal chronicled Jonas's desperate attempts to protect the townsfolk from an ancient force, a malevolent entity that hungered for souls. As the traveler read on, Jonas described rituals performed in secrecy, sacrifices offered to sate the entity's appetite. Heart pounding, the traveler flipped through pages filled with crude diagrams and incantations, hoping to find a way to dispel the darkness that had claimed the town. Jonas wrote of a hidden crypt, deep beneath the town's cemetery, a place where the entity could be confronted, where its power could be challenged. Gathering their resolve, the traveler decided to seek out this crypt, believing it to be the key to restoring the town and uncovering the fate of its vanished inhabitants. With each step towards the cemetery, the traveler's footsteps echoed in the silence, a stark reminder of the absence of life in the once bustling streets. The cemetery gates groaned as they swung open, revealing a path overgrown with ivy and neglect. Tombstones, weathered and worn, bore names that echoed in the traveler's mind, names they had read in the town records, names that now whispered of lives cut short by a relentless darkness. At the far end of the cemetery, shrouded in the shadows of ancient oaks, lay the entrance to the crypt. Stone steps descended into darkness, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Torch in hand, the traveler descended, heart pounding with each echoing footfall. Deep within the crypt's bowels, illuminated by flickering torchlight, the traveler found carvings on the walls, symbols of protection and warnings against the entity that lurked below. A heavy stone door marked the final barrier, etched with runes that Jonas had described in his journal as a ward against the darkness. With a deep breath, the traveler pushed against the door, muscles straining against its weight. As it creaked open, a gust of stale air rushed out, carrying with it the faint whisper of voices, echoes of the town's lost souls, urging them forward into the unknown depths. Inside, the crypt opened into a chamber lined with ancient sarcophagi, each one a testament to lives that had been claimed by the entity's hunger. In the center of the chamber, a pedestal stood, upon which rested a gleaming artifact, an amulet pulsing with a faint, otherworldly glow. Heart pounding, the traveler approached the amulet, feeling its power thrum in their veins. According to Jonas's writings, the amulet was the key to binding the entity, to banishing it back to the darkness from whence it came. Yet, to use it meant risking everything, their very soul, perhaps. As the traveler reached out to grasp the amulet, a cold wind swept through the chamber, carrying with it a whisper, a voice that echoed in the depths of their mind, promising power and salvation in exchange for a price too terrible to contemplate. With resolve, the traveler tore their gaze away from the amulet, gripping the torch tighter as they chanted the incantation Jonas had transcribed in his journal. The chamber filled with an ethereal light, shadows twisting and writhing as the entity stirred, sensing the threat to its dominion. In a final act of defiance, the traveler raised the amulet high, its glow intensifying as it drew upon the traveler's willpower and the ancient magic imbued within. With a cry that echoed through the crypt, they unleashed the amulet's power, a burst of blinding light that enveloped the chamber, searing away the darkness and the entity that had plagued the town for centuries. As the light faded, the crypt fell silent once more, the air heavy with the remnants of magic and the echoes of lost souls. The traveler, breathless and trembling, collapsed to their knees, clutching the amulet tightly in trembling hands. Above ground, the sun began to rise, casting its golden light over the silent town. Birdsong filled the air, a chorus of life returning to a place long shrouded in darkness. The traveler emerged from the crypt, carrying the amulet as a beacon of hope, a promise that the town could heal, that its lost souls could finally find peace. Yet, as they stood amidst the quiet streets, the traveler couldn't shake the feeling of eyes upon them, eyes that watched from hidden places, whispers of gratitude and sorrow lingering in the breeze. The journey to save the silent town had only just begun, for its scars ran deep, etched into the very fabric of its existence. But for now, as the first light of dawn washed away the shadows, the traveler allowed themselves a moment of quiet triumph, a moment to breathe in the newfound peace and to hope that, someday, the silent town would be known not for its darkness, but for the courage that had vanquished it. The travelers stood at the edge of the town square, clutching the worn leather-bound journal they had found in the abandoned library. The sky above was a deep shade of indigo, the last remnants of daylight fading into a velvety darkness that cloaked the town in an eerie stillness. According to the journal, tonight was the night when the entity that had haunted this town for decades would return to claim its tribute. The traveler had spent days deciphering the cryptic writings, tracing the history of the town back to its origins and uncovering the dark pact that had bound its people to this malevolent force. As the clock tower struck midnight, a chill wind swept through the deserted streets, carrying with it the faintest whisper of voices long gone. The traveler knew they had little time left to prepare. Following the instructions meticulously laid out in the journal, they had gathered the necessary items: salt from the mines that once sustained the town, candles blessed by a priest in a nearby village, and a talisman carved from the ancient oak that stood sentinel at the town's entrance. With trembling hands, the traveler began to draw the protective circle in the center of the square, marking it with symbols of warding and binding. Each stroke of chalk felt like an eternity, the weight of centuries-old sorrow and fear pressing down on their shoulders. The air crackled with a palpable tension, as if the very fabric of reality strained against the impending confrontation. A sudden rustling from the shadows made the traveler's heart skip a beat. They turned, expecting to confront the entity in its true form, but instead found themselves facing a spectral figure, a faint outline of a woman, her features blurred and ethereal. "Help us," the ghostly figure whispered, her voice a mournful echo of the past. "End this curse." The traveler nodded solemnly, their resolve hardening with each passing moment. They lit the candles around the circle, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the cobblestones. The journal had warned of the entity's cunning, its ability to deceive and beguile those who dared to challenge it. But the traveler had come too far to turn back now. As the final sigil was etched into place, a low, ominous hum filled the air. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and from the darkness emerged a swirling vortex of malevolent energy. The entity materialized before them, a grotesque amalgamation of shadow and malice, its form shifting and twisting like smoke in the wind. "You dare defy me," it hissed, its voice a discordant cacophony that echoed off the walls of empty buildings. "Foolish mortal, you cannot banish that which has dwelt here for centuries." The travelers stood their ground, their hands steady despite the rising tide of fear threatening to overwhelm them. They brandished the talisman and recited the incantation from the journal, each word resonating with ancient power. The entity recoiled, its form flickering as if struggling against unseen bonds. "You will not prevail," it spat, its voice a desperate shriek that reverberated through the night. "This town is mine." With a final surge of determination, the traveler thrust the talisman into the heart of the swirling vortex. Light erupted from the runes inscribed upon it, piercing the darkness and enveloping the entity in a blinding cascade of pure, cleansing energy. The creature let out a deafening scream, its essence dissipating like mist in the morning sun. Silence descended upon the town once more. The traveler collapsed to their knees, the weight of their exertion finally catching up to them. They looked around at the empty streets, now bathed in the soft glow of dawn breaking on the horizon. The curse had been broken, the townspeople's spirits finally freed from their torment. As the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of pink and gold, the traveler knew it was time to leave. The journal, its pages now filled with their own handwritten notes and observations, would remain behind as a testament to their journey. With one last glance at the now tranquil town, they turned and walked away, their footsteps echoing faintly in the quiet morning air. The silent town had found its peace at last.